So whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I don't see the full screen either. Okay, this looks a bit better, but it's also not showing the full next time screen, okay? Yeah. I think it's decided that there are too many things that are annoying about the projector. For better or worse, I wanted to cover this time a few things that many of you may know from some undergrad modules. They're not completely the same, but there's some repetition. But I think it's useful to recap some basics there before we extend them a bit. So if you want, it might be an easier time today, if you've seen that before. So I could have put it on Slido, but since it's a small group, who has seen these algorithms, Knuth-Morris-Pratt and string matching with finite automata? Yeah, those who were teaching, are supposed to teach it, I guess, have seen it. How about the others? The KMP algorithm, Knuth-Morris-Pratt specifically, that's the main one. You have not seen that in undergrad? How about you? Okay, then it's very worthwhile going through this. These are really cool kind of foundational algorithms that maybe you'll enjoy, and they're useful to know, I think. So welcome back to Algorithms of Bioinformatics. Chapter 5 is about string matching. Biologically motivating is a slightly different term for roughly the same problem, the read mapping problem. And I'll start commenting a bit on that, and then we'll go through several rounds of formalizing the problem and solving it in different aspects. The same motivation will keep us busy for a bit longer than just this part, because there's a few shortcomings of the part that we'll cover today that for biology aren't sufficient, and also the performance wouldn't be good enough. So it's a big chunk. Also, all developed in the last 25 years. So it's compared to some other algorithms that we covered here and that you cover elsewhere, is fairly recent stuff. What's the read mapping problem about? So you may remember from last unit that we were looking at genome assembly and the exploding newspaper problem as a metaphor for what this puzzle is looking like. You have these many short fragments, and you're trying to reassemble the genome from that. The technical term for this approach, by the way, is shotgun sequencing, and that's the official term that people use, where the shotgun corresponds to the many small bits. You're somehow breaking your DNA into these small pieces, and you only read off the small pieces. The puzzle, the burnt pieces of newspaper, the short segments, are called reads in this context. That's the pieces of DNA that you can read. I think I've used that term in the previous unit as well, but here it comes up in a slightly different context. But remember, these are just these snippets of DNA. In terms of the scale, if we stay with human genomes, you'll know by if you wake up in the middle of the night, the number of nucleotides in the human genome is roughly 3 billion. It's a good number to keep in mind. To make any of these techniques from last time work at all, you probably want to cover every position 30 times. And people often do a bit more to be on the safe side, because I showed the videos last time about these sequencing machines. They often produce much more than that in just one go, so you might as well. But a reasonable lower estimate might be 30x coverage. So having every position should be covered by, on average, 30 little fragments. That means that's 300 million little reads, each of a few hundred characters. So roughly, if you don't compress it, already 60 gigabyte of raw data. That's just the reads. Now, these you would want to feed into the algorithms from last week to assemble a genome. And indeed, for genome sequencing, also from some species that have larger genomes than humans. The main bottleneck is not the lab techniques. The main bottleneck is the computational part. So luckily, we don't always have to do that. We now have, for humans at least, a reference genome that we can somehow try to make use of. Whereas this was called de novo sequencing, so sequencing from scratch, as if we knew nothing. Maybe we don't have to do that all the time. And there's another motivation for why we may not want to do de novo sequencing all the time. That is how full genome sequencing is actually used for medical applications. It turns out that having the full sequence of your genome is great, but is also overwhelming. For medical diagnoses, we wouldn't even know so well what to do with this full genome. What is much more helpful for very specific kind of diseases or genetic mutations that are known to cause problems is much more localized. So to make it more concrete, this is a specific example that's explained with a bit more context in the book, is some form of disability of mental retardation called the Odo syndrome. And people trace down from patients suffering from this and comparing their genomes that it's a single mutation that causes a specific protein to be cut short. Essentially, we know now that this means there's a stop codon where there shouldn't be one. And these can be caused by changing a single letter in the genome. And this is indeed something that happens occasionally because a single mutation is not as unlikely as larger changes. And biologists call it a single nucleotide polymorphism, or a SNP. And these are, in this case, indeed causing or indicating this specific syndrome. And there's other examples. So if there was a way for, say, a person to sequence their genome and just check for these specific single base replacements, that often is enough to detect certain genetic diseases. We don't really need the full sequencing of the genome. For many cases, we wouldn't even make use of that. So let's try not to do that, and instead imagine the slightly simpler task. There's the long human reference genome, and you're trying for your reads, which this is not to scale, they're much shorter, right? You're just trying to find the best place where they match, and maybe in this matching process you detect, it matches but one character. And then that can be by looking up where certain genes are located in the reference genome, where we have all that information. We can try to identify or check for specific genetic diseases. Most of the things that commercial providers do with your genome, if you ask them to sequence it and then give you some analysis of potential genetic problems that may at some point haunt you, that's usually what they do. And that's usually all they do. That's my current state of knowledge anyways. So to formalize what this means for the computer science part, for the computational question, is the read mapping problem. We're given a text, that's the reference genome, one long sequence, and we're supposedly that's correct and done. And then a whole collection of patterns, short reads, that's from the new patient that we're checking. Now, just to comment on the notation, we talk about the same thing. It's only going to come up later again. The text is of length n, and the patterns are of length mr, so they could be different lengths. We typically think of these as being much, much shorter than n. Remember, n is 3 billion, m might be 200. But the number of reads, the little p, this might also be big. That was 200 million in the human genome example. I'll write p as the vector, as an array of all the patterns, and each of the patterns itself is a vector or an array of characters, of nucleotides in our case. So to have a bit more convenient notation, PR is one pattern and P is the collection of all patterns. Okay. So that's the input. What are we trying to find? We're trying to find the best matches for these reads in the genome. Now, what best match means is up for definition. This is a template for different problems, the read mapping problem. It's not really one well-defined problem yet. Best match, I guess the gold standard would be something based on our alignment algorithms. In particular, these semi-local alignments, that just means you're allowed to slide it along the genome in any way. Another term was fitting alignment. That's what's used in the book. So you're trying to use all of the pattern, but you can zoom into a specific region of the genome. Now, that turns out to be very expensive and not really doable with the amount of data we have. We can try to be a little less precise and say, instead of an alignment that includes insertions, deletions, I'm only allowing mismatches. Then maybe that's still not quite doable. And instead we say, if the best I can find for my pattern is a match with many mismatches still, then I'm also okay to not report that, because it seems to be some error. Maybe there was some contamination of the sequencing probe, right? It's not actually part of the human genome that I'm interested. It's some other dirt particle, whatever it was. So I'm only interested in the matches that are close enough. And for the SNPs, that's exactly what we do. Single nucleotide polymorphism would be a match of the read with a single mismatch. So this seems very restricted, but is actually very useful for this application we just discussed. The last one is least biologically correct, but is computationally cheapest. That's only exact matches. And we'll focus on this last one for now for two reasons. First of all, it's easier, and we have to start somewhere. But also, these other variants can partially be built on this. In particular, the case with a single mismatch, you can maybe intuitively, without going into much detail, if there's a long string that matches with a single mismatch, well, there's also going to be a large part of that string that matches without any mismatch. The mismatch is only one, it can't be everywhere. But also that it simplifies the problem is of interest to us here. And so for the first part, forget about the read mapping problem in these other variants. It's always going to be about exact matches for now. That problem is generally known as string matching or pattern matching, and is a still well-studied problem. To be able to talk about it without making any ambiguous statements, excuse me. Let's introduce some notation for that. I'll keep things general, except for some cases where we'll restrict to the parameters that are interesting for our bioinformatics context. All the strings come from some alphabet. That's just the allowable letters. And the size of the alphabet sometimes pops up. That's this little sigma. I think all the algorithms essentially assume that these are just numbers. So the first sigma integers. Of course, for DNA, that would be just the 4 nucleotides. It could also be the amino acids if you're talking about protein. The methods are more generic, and everything in a computer is a string. So oftentimes you can apply the same techniques. But for us, you can think of sigma being really small and fixed. Then a string is denoted as the sigma to the n as a tuple of length n. Sigma star is this unspecified length, so a union over all lengths. I don't know if we even need this. That occurs, epsilon is the empty string. That's important. And then there's a bit of notation that essentially just says strings are arrays, and I use the same notation as for arrays. So this you've seen many times before, S0n starting at 0. Sometimes we'll write the concatenation explicitly. You've seen that before, I think. Substrings is important, so we'll talk about some starting index and an exclusive end index. And two specific terms that will pop up, prefix and suffix. Prefix is a substring that starts at the beginning, suffix is a substring that ends at the end. Maybe familiar to many. In case of doubt, you can look at this slide. With that, we can further narrow down the problem we're looking at. It differs from the read mapping problem specifically in that we're only having one pattern here. So there's the same kind of text and characters, and then we have one pattern of length m. In the read mapping context, we'll have many of these patterns. So for now, we'll just assume you do one pattern after the other. Okay, then what you're looking for, this you can also get into debates about. The easiest might be to think about finding the first match of the pattern in the text. For read mapping, probably you want to do all occurrences of the pattern in the text. If the pattern does not occur at all, then we return some dummy value. Right. Maybe also keep that in mind. The way the notation is defined, you can quickly say a length m substring of the text starting at I is this. So if that's the same as the pattern, that's a match. Okay. Now in undergrad modules, you would spend a bit more time on explaining this one bullet, how to do it trivially. I'm not going to go there, but let me briefly say that you can solve the string matching problem by trying every starting position I that would be allowed, and then checking the next m characters. Do they match at this position with the pattern or not? Okay. So that always works, and it can find the first match, or it can find all matches as you like. The total number of character comparisons, so individual characters between string and pattern that we compare, is roughly n times m. And that's going to be a bit too much for read mapping. For a single pattern, maybe still doable because m is not humongous, but we'll not want to do this for the combined length of all the patterns. That said, if you look at what some standard libraries do, for example, the Java library, they essentially use this brute force string matching method. Python's method is much more sophisticated and would maybe even be good enough for this bioinformatics context. The Java one, the one I've seen when I last checked anyways, would, for the kind of data we have, not work well, because the typical thing that is tricky for these string matching methods is if the alphabet is very small, because then you have a lot of partial matches just out of random luck, and also long repetitions both within the pattern and in the genome. These tend to be potentially dangerous for the string matching methods. So even though this is the worst case running time for these simple methods, they often are better on average. But in the case of bioinformatics data, the worst case might actually happen, or close to the worst case might actually happen. In the next section, we'll see how to do better. And for that, we'll also establish some common ground for several future methods. So it's worth spending a little time on that part. It's also an invitation to kind of apply all your knowledge about automata theory if you've had some undergrad introduction. If you've seen these kind of things, regular expression and formal languages, you could say string matching is nothing but deciding whether the text has a specific pattern, matches this regular expression, namely an arbitrary string followed by the pattern followed by more arbitrary string. That's what pattern matching asks about. And because this right-hand side is a regular expression, there's an automated pipeline of algorithms that gets you from this description of the language a deterministic finite automaton, a small little machine or program where you can feed the text through and it'll tell you whether the text has this shape. And so with that, you can check for an occurrence of P in exactly n steps. You see one letter in the text exactly once. You can even tweak this automaton to give you all the occurrences, but then we'll come to that. So as a theoretical computer scientist, maybe you would say that's all that's needed. For a practitioner, there's a few things that are left open. First of all, maybe none of this made any sense to you. If that's you, then don't worry. This is connecting to some other TCS topics, but we don't require to use them. Even if you do know these things, that this automaton exists doesn't mean you can efficiently construct it. And indeed, the automaton might be big if you're just looking at the worst case of these constructions. It turns out that for the problem we're trying to solve, for the specific kind of regular expression, the automaton is never big, and you can always find it fairly efficiently. But for that, you have to use the specific structure of the specific regular expression. Jumping to the end, for those of you who haven't seen this, this is what one of these automata can look like. And let's see how it proceeds through a text to check if there's an occurrence. So we have this pattern P, A, B, A, B, A, C, A. This is what you find if you read from left to right through the state transitions. And each time on the arc, you see the next letter of the pattern. The way such an automaton works is that you initially start in the state 0 because that's where this arrow goes through. So it says that's the starting state. And then in each time step, you read one more letter from the text and you follow the arc with that letter. And the way the automaton is built means that there's always exactly one choice. And so let's quickly do that. We start in state 0. Then after reading an A, the first letter of T, we move to state 1. Now in state 1, we read another A, which here says you should stay in state 1. Then we read a B from state 1. That brings us to state 2. Then from state 2, we read another A. Aha, that brings us to state 3. In state 3, now we read a C, that's the next letter in the text. And that tells us to go all the way back. Okay, tough luck. So we have to do that. And then you keep going. In each time step, you consume exactly one character. So after n steps, the text is processed entirely. And you find, if you do that here, that at some certain point, you reach this state 7. And that's a special state because it's marked with these double lines. It's an accepting state. That signals I've seen the pattern. The way it's set up here says, after I've seen this state 7 once, I'm going to stay there for good. So this automaton only finds the first occurrence of the patterns. But you could easily extend this, so get rid of these transitions, add others. We'll come to which ones. And then the same automaton can be used to feed the text through once and find all occurrences. Namely, whenever I'm passing through this state 7, I'm going to say, hey, I've seen the pattern just now. And then you can output the starting index. OK, that's a deterministic finite automaton. It's finite because it's finite size, has a fixed number of states. They're given by the length of the pattern. It's deterministic because in each step, there was only exactly one choice, no matter what the next character in the text was. Now, why would this even make sense that such an automaton can exist? Why do I not need to know the actual history of the text? Why can I build a single automaton just from the pattern and it works for any text without remembering the previous parts of the text? At first, this should give you pause if you've never thought about this, why this even works. But the reason is that if you've seen some initial portion of the pattern, and then you see another character there's two options. Either you can extend to a one longer portion of the pattern by having one more character, or that doesn't work, but then all that you can have now is a potentially shorter version of the shorter prefix of the pattern if you always keep track of the longest prefix that you've seen so far. That's why here the meaning, the semantics of being in a certain state is the longest prefix of the pattern I can have seen so far by reading through the text has that many characters. If that's the case, then any transition can only reduce the length of this if there's a mismatch. And that means all the characters that you need to find out how far you have to go back in the pattern, that's all determined by the prefix that you previously matched. And these characters before that, they're not interesting. They're never used. All the information that we could potentially need is contained in this prefix of the pattern and the next character. Now you've seen how we can use such an automaton if you're already given one. Of course, you also want to compute them given a pattern, right? And again, you can take a short visit to the theory of formal languages and automata. There's a different kind of automaton. And here I'm stressing this again because we'll use the very same trick later in the context of using several patterns. The other kind of automaton is a non-deterministic one, where there's two new features. You can have several or no edges for certain letters, which means you can have several continuations, or maybe also none, in which case one computation dies out. And you could also have epsilon transitions, which means you can spontaneously go from a state to another without consuming a character. With this extra freedom, an automaton that matches exactly this pattern is very easy. It's just the pattern written down, plus an option to stay in state 0. And then it's up to the user of this automaton to figure out when you should start moving to the right or when you should stay in state 0. And the point is, once you started moving along this line, you have to kind of hopefully know the future that you can keep continuing. Because if you ever read a character that's not the next in the pattern, the whole computation just stalls because there's no edge that you can follow. Now this seems utterly useless. First of all, it's just a pattern written down with some extra arrows added. Why is that even useful? Despite this, you can actually use this to find the pattern by on the fly simulating all possible computations. So now this is almost a bit like if it was some quantum system, but there's no quantum in there. I'm just imagining I'm being simultaneously in all states that I could be. I don't know, positively framed schizophrenia, whatever. Initially, I can only be in state 0 because that's the starting state. But I can read an A now in two ways. I could either go to state 1 if I guess that's the beginning of the pattern, or I could stay in state 0 if that is not the beginning. So after reading this A, I'm in two states at the same time. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's my that's what I call positive schizophrenia, if that exists. Okay, I'm not making fun of the mental illness. So let's skip that term. But if I'm simultaneously in states 0 and 1 and read another A, as I'm doing now, this first one where I'm in state 1, that dies out and I'm stuck. So this has no successors. Whereas the state 0 gives me the same two I had previously. I can go to state 1 or stay. So I'm still in states 0 and 1. If I read a B now, then this state 1 brings me to state 2. But I could have also stayed in state 0 from being in 0. So after this, I'm in states 0 and 2 simultaneously. If from this I read another A, from state 2 I get to 3, and from state 0 I get to either state 0 again or state 1. So now I'm split thrice. And you can see how this keeps going maybe. In each step, you take all the possible edges from all the possible states you can be in. If there's any way for you to reach some configuration where state 7 is a possibility, then there was some way in the past, at some point you took the right turn that led you to the accepting state. And that means the overall computation is accepting. In this case, that means I've seen the pattern starting 7 characters ago. And at that time, one of the options was to follow the path. So you could have said, I don't need to do any fancy construction. I just take my pattern, write it as the edges on these states with numbers. And in each time step, I just simulate what I can have done, what I could have done. All possible options. While this is possible, keeping track of this set of states makes things a bit more expensive. And we actually don't need that. We can do all that happens here, we can pre-process that, and that speeds up the computation. Now you could say, fine, what I'm actually doing here is turning a non-deterministic finite automaton into a deterministic one, and there's a general algorithm that does that for any such automaton. But as our practitioner rightly objects, that has exponential blow up in the number of states, at least in the worst case. And so that doesn't sound appealing. But it turns out here, in this specific case, for the specific types of non-deterministic automata that we have, it can never happen. You never get this exponential blow up. Indeed, you don't get any extra states at all. That's what's behind the Knuth-Morris-Pratt algorithm. It's a sequence of insights that I attribute here to them that lead to their final algorithm. And the first one is that we can do this construction for the special automaton much more efficiently. One way to say it is that we can construct this automaton inductively. What's missing from, if you compare this one to the previous string matching automaton here, is all the other edges. The edges here along the path are the same, but then if I'm not seeing the next character of the pattern, I have to do something. And I have to do the right something. If I'm just pointing these all back to 0, I might miss some occurrences. So I have to point these arrows in the right way. And that's the part that we still have to do. And for that, you can assume you construct this automaton step by step, making the pattern 1 character longer in each step. That means adding a new state, j plus 1, the new accepting state. The edge that leads into this one is predetermined. That's the j plus 1 character in the pattern. But for the previous state, there used to be this state j that used to be the accepting state before the pattern grew. That now loses its state as an accepting state. And it needs to get these extra edges that go back. So we need to find out where these go. In the formal notation for automata, we write delta as a function that gives for a current state and the next symbol that we read in the text, the next target state. That's the endpoints of these arcs in the diagram. That's what we have to compute. And it turns out you can inductively do this. All that you need to compute the target of this delta is already in the automaton that you constructed. And so you can bootstrap the automaton to find where you have to go. For this part, so there's an intuitive version. Let me maybe go back to the example to sketch this. Here's our example automaton. And the interesting bits are, for example, when I'm in state 5 here. And I'm now asking, where should I go with this edge that has a B? Okay. Now we know the answer is we go to 4. What 5 means is that I've seen from the text something, and then a beginning of the pattern. Namely, I've seen 5 characters of the pattern. A, B, A, B, A. Let's maybe put this explicitly on top. And now the scenario with my arc here is the next character I'm seeing is another B. And this is a mismatch. The next character I would have wanted to see in the pattern is a C, not a B. Now, the target state I have to go to is the longest prefix of the pattern that I can bring in alignment with these characters from the text that I've seen. And so what intuitively you want to do is shift the pattern to the right one step at a time until it matches. Shifting it one step to the right would mean I'm putting this in alignment. We made it so that not any single character matches, so that doesn't work. If I shift one more though, sorry, did I make a mistake here? No. If I shift 2 positions, then A, B, all matches. The length of this pattern, of this prefix of the pattern that I found here, that's the same as P04. It's the first 4 characters of the pattern, which means I should go to state 4 if I read a B from state 5. Okay? That's the intuition behind where we should go. Now, another way to arrive at that same target of the arc is to start at the automaton at the beginning and simulate where it ends up if I read the text that starts there, because that's by definition what the automaton should do. Now, if I do this starting at A, I know where it ends up, namely in state 5, up to the B, up to this point. I know where it ends up in state 5 because that's where we started from. So how can I get the automaton to simulate where it ends up in state 4? I don't know how far I have to shift the pattern, but I can just omit the first character and start reading BA in the automaton, and that will magically get me to essentially where I need to go. So I go B, A, and from there I can read another B. And that brings me to state 4, which is the target of my arrow. So we get the same answer, this 4. That's also reading in the automaton from state 0 with the same pattern, P1 up to 5. Followed by a B. And P1 means I'm leaving off the first character. And so what I mean by this delta here is just you start at state 0 and then you consecutively read these characters and follow the transitions. So all I need to produce these new arcs is to simulate the automaton that I'm currently building. That sounds potentially dangerous because it might use the edges that I'm just defining now. Right, so it sounds like this could be a problem. But it is not a problem if you build the automaton from left to right, because then you can work out that the arcs that you're using in the simulation where you leave off the first character, that can only be using parts of the automaton that you've already constructed in the previous step. So in particular here, it's entirely contained in this automaton just for the first J characters. or j minus 1. There's always this offset. I think aj has j minus 1 characters, correct? Because it leads to state j. The index shift is always a nightmare. That's the new automaton. aj plus 1 leads to state j. So I guess it has the same number of characters. Okay. So up to state j. But the arcs are only computed up to state j minus 1. The last one doesn't have outgoing arcs. But the main point is the length of the longest prefix that I could possibly see is always one shorter. And so it's always part of the automaton that I've computed already. That means we can get all the transitions by simulating the automaton on the one shorter prefix. But it sounds like this is expensive because you always have to run the automaton from the beginning. Again, my example would have been if we're currently looking to build the transitions from 5. So we're only seeing this prefix of the automaton. We don't know where these go yet. Now I'm trying to add the state 6 and the edges out of 5. I've added the edge for B. Let's do the transition for A, just to be sure that we understand the pattern. We've seen BA, AB, AB, A, but now we're seeing another A. What we have to do is read from the beginning in the automaton, starting without the first character, so BA, BA, A. If we do that from here, it's BA, BA, A. So we go to state 1, and that's where the arc from 5 also goes. Now, this sounds like each time for every arc, I have to start from the beginning and walk for potentially up to m characters. That sounds expensive. That's what this alludes to. That's the number of edges from every state, the sigma outgoing edges. And each seems to require simulating the automaton. But it turns out that's also not needed. The second insight that these gentlemen had was that these simulations share a lot. I don't know if the way I quickly showed it in the example maybe was too quick to see it. But it's clear if you always have this P1 up to J followed by one other character. This prefix will always be the same because the automaton is deterministic. It has to do the same thing on the first J characters. And it's only the last character that leads from there to a slightly different state. So we can very efficiently compute this automaton. Here's a very simple piece of code that does this. Let's illustrate this while also trying to do the intuitive version. We start with state 0. That's a 0 with one circle, not a double circle. There's nothing to do in that state. So then we add one more state, 1, with the first character A. And there's the 0 always has some arcs back to itself with everything but A. Then let's add another state, the 2, with a B. Now from state 1, I need outgoing arcs for anything but B. Okay? I'm in this situation, I've read an A. That's why I'm in state 1. And now I could, instead of a B, either see a C or another A. That's the two cases, let's handle them together. Then I'll just simulate the automaton on the one shorter prefix. So I'm starting in state 0, and one shorter prefix is just this single character, A or C. If I have an A, I'm going to state 1. So the outgoing arc from 1 with an A should be 1 again. If I see a C, then I stay in state 0, and nothing happens here. Okay, state 0, I can also fill that in with an A. We go to 1, and otherwise we stay in 0. If I'm in state 1 with a B, then I go to state 2. Okay, let's do one more. So state 3, we go there with an A. That's the match edge for the third character in the pattern. But now we also need the edges from 2. I didn't draw these. So there's a loop with A, and I go back with C. Now, I've added this new state 3. That means I've seen AB up to state 2. Now, if I am in state 2 and don't see an A, I don't know yet what to do. So let's see what I do if I see a B or a C. Again, get rid of the first character and do the simulation. We start in 0, we do 1B, that keeps us in state 0. Now from state 0, I can do a B or a C. A B and a C both keeps me in state 0. Okay, not much happens. Next state, a bit more space, is another B. And 3 goes back to 0 with A and C. Sorry, the 2. Deleting too much. I'm adding state 4, so I need the outgoing arcs of state 3. State 3 means I've just seen ABA. Now, if I see a B, I know where to go. If I don't see a B, then I could either have another A or a C. Where does that lead me to? Well, get rid of the first character, do B, A, and then an A keeps me in state 1, and a C brings me back to 0. Okay? So you see how this goes. Now, in this case, that was the slow algorithm where I each time started simulating the algorithm from scratch. Now observe, I could have omitted that by remembering where I left off in the previous step. What do I mean by that? Let's start again with adding the arcs for state 2. I added the arcs for state 2 by reading a single B that brought me to state 0. So I remember this is where I was. And then for state 2, I had to read where this is a B, right? Confusing here. So again, I'm trying to construct the outgoing arcs for state 2. I do that by reading a B in the automaton. That brings me to this state where I have to take the last edge from. And then both B and C from X stay in state 0. That's why from 2 I have 2 zeros here. Now if I go to the next state, meaning I want to construct the outgoing arcs of state 3, I would run the automaton on the prefix without the first character, so on B and A. But I already know where B led me to, namely X. So I can just keep X and update that one step. So if I go with X, where it brings me when I read an A from here, then X is now this state. The outgoing edges from 3 are wherever I go from X if I read the other characters, A or C. And A brings me back to state 1. So with an A from 3, I go to here. And a C from here brings me back to 0. So I'm joining this long edge back with a C. Now, the cleverness of this is that I just need to remember where I left off and do one update step instead of starting from scratch all over each time. And that's also what this algorithm does. You can formulate it as essentially copying a column of this transition matrix. Okay, so far so good. It's always a bit confusing with the index shifts, etc. But if you meticulously follow the simulation, it's always working out. It's just a bit slow. So here's the example worked out if you want to double check. The reason I'm not spending more effort, more time on this specific code is that this is not the final solution yet. As an intermediate summary, this does work well. In particular, once you've built the automaton, the matching, feeding the text through this automaton is very efficient. For each character in the text, you just follow one arc. Building the automaton with this fancy algorithm is taking as much time as it needs to write down the matrix. So that's clearly best possible, because the object you construct has that many edges. So you need that time to write it down. So the total time is this for string matching, which is already fairly good. The downside mainly is if the alphabet is really big, this might be wasteful, both in space and time. For the bioinformatics application, you could say there's not much to worry about here. Our alphabet is either 4 or maybe 20 characters. Factor 20 in space maybe is okay. A factor 20 in time, okay. What ran an hour now runs a day. But fine, maybe it's okay. But really we can do slightly better here. Before we go there, shall we take our break? It's about half time. If you have questions, I've ran through this fairly quickly. I'll summarize at the end of the next chapter which parts you definitely want to keep in mind and which parts you can say, I'm going to look those up in an undergrad module once I need it. Was a question?
Mostly talking about the vision of the room. So I guess that's not too important if you know the KMP algorithm.
Sure. The main goal for this part, apart from catching people up, is to generalize it for the Aho-Korosig algorithm. I don't know if you've seen that one. You can do the same as in KM. Okay, if not, that's great. Then maybe you enjoy it. In one word, in one sentence, it's KMP with several patterns. And by and large, like if you zoom out enough, the exactly same strategy works. You can build an automaton with several patterns, and you can do what will be failure links. Sorry, I'm forward referencing a bit. But there's an additional catch that is subtle enough to maybe mention. The algorithm is well known, but not often taught. It seems it fell a bit out of fashion for no good reason, just because it has a few intricacies, but is not a complicated algorithm. But I think it's very useful in some cases to reason about things. And yeah, Tamir found a nice exercise, or 2 exercise problems that we'll have to kill half of. What? Yeah, I'll make sure that the selection is reasonable effort.
By the way,
And as I mentioned before, like treat the exercises as an excuse to have some puzzling fun. If you don't solve all the problems, that's fine, right? You don't need to solve all the problems. You need to show reasonable attempts for at least half of the problems. That's the criteria. Yeah, I know. Once you get started, kind of ambition kicks in.
but please make sure
The problem is at least correct the way it's stated. That helps.
yeah, that would help. And the number of points for each sheet. The difference is a lot, because we had one sheet with 140 points and some sheets with just 40. I don't know, maybe even that counts.
Which one was 140? That sounds indeed a bit much, yeah.
The metric sheet 5.
I see, yeah.
Because exercise 1, did I remember correct? Exercise 1 was 40 and exercise 2 was 10, 40, 10, 40.
Yeah, that's right. It's 140. Yeah.
Big difference.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, it's indeed something I underestimated. The way the 6 credits modules are set up is half the lectures, same amount of exercises, same amount of exercise class, or same 2 SWS. Which just means it's much harder to balance the sheets out because you're covering the material of 90 minutes, and not all, turns out, maybe unsurprising, not all topics in a lecture are equally well suited to make useful exercises from that are at roughly the right level and so on. So this is sometimes a bit tricky. Some weeks I struggled to find sensible questions, and other weeks I had a collection that I felt sorry for all the good questions I couldn't ask because it was already too much. Now we could maybe try to overflow into the next sheet a bit more, planning ahead a bit better. Maybe the 40 points for some of the metric questions was also too much. I don't know. Yeah, not all were super hard there. My main message is don't get too obsessed about the exercise points, just because the goal is not to kick anyone out for not solving some puzzles. If you make sensible efforts, you should always pass these 50% of the points. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of priced in that not all puzzles are solvable in the time. What's that? Glad to hear that, or what do you say? I think this week is also not as much effort. It's maybe
quite a long time on last weekend trying to figure out the runtime bound that was possible. Searching for tricks.
Yeah, I've will be more careful with writing down the exact solution to see if the running time is the analysis covers all parts of the algorithm. Okay, time for the final piece in this algorithm. We're almost at the final solution that Knuth, Morris, and Pratt came up with. The string matching automaton that we've seen can already be constructed efficiently. The only part that was suboptimal was this dependence on the size of the alphabet. And if you carefully remember or watch how we constructed the automaton, it was already suggesting an improvement. Namely, I was in the simulation updating this state X, where then you have to take all the edges from. Why not just keep that state instead of copying all the edges? That's the third insight that they had. If you want, you can say this is the way I presented it as following from automata theory is exactly what led us into this slightly suboptimal way. Because this is the best you can do if you insist on having a classical deterministic finite automaton. But if you don't, then you can slightly modify the type of automaton and the type of computation on these automata that you do, and then the dependence on sigma can be avoided. In the automata world, what we use is now a special type of arc called a failure link, which the rules are you're only allowed or you're forced to take the failure link if you cannot follow the edges with characters. In all the automata here, there will only be a single edge with a character on it. So if you're sitting here and you don't see a C, you have to follow this failure link. But you do not consume the next character of the text. The failure links are just updating the state of the automaton. You're still looking at the same character in the text. And then you try again. Maybe it wasn't a C here, so you had to go there. But maybe it's a B that you can read from here now. It could also happen that it's an A, so you can neither follow the C nor the B. Then you have to follow another failure link and another until you can finally read this. Because these failure links don't consume characters, it might mean that we have to follow several of them before we make progress in the text. Now note that the computations are still unambiguous. It's still always a single thing that you can do, either follow an edge or follow a failure link. So it's still a deterministic computation. But still, if you want, it doesn't map to any of the standard automata classes. But I would say that's the fault of the definitions from automata theory, not the fault of this automata. It's a fine computation device, in particular deterministic. What's also obvious here is every state needs just two edges, a match edge and a failure link, no dependence on sigma. Here's an example of how you can use this automaton to match in the text. I don't want to give this example in full detail. It works as I sketched. There's always just one thing that you can do. It might sometimes mean that you go through several failure links before you can process a character. Well, that's just how it works. Here's code for simulating the automaton. So what the example showed is written up in specific code. I'm not going to read through the code really. It keeps track of the state and the position in the text, and the rest is fairly straightforward, given if you understand the automaton, you could reproduce this code. The code is here for the analysis, because now, as shown in this example, it can potentially take you a long time before you process the next character in the text. And in the code, this also shows there's an outer loop that says, I'm going to go through the positions in the text, but I'm not always making progress. This position in the text, is incremented here and here. But I might spend a lot of time always in this other case where I'm following failure links. So the danger seems to be that I might take more than linear time in this algorithm if I'm often running into this second state where I don't make progress. I is not incremented. But if you look closely, there is something that changes, namely Q. So in each iteration, either I increases or Q decreases, because the failure link is always strictly going to the left. So you can do an amortized analysis of this loop, where each individual character may see many failure links, but summed over all the characters of the text, you cannot see much on average. Intuitively, you could say, before you have to follow failure links for a long time, you must have used match edges to get to the right. But you can only get to the right one step at a time, consuming one character in the text each. The failure links might jump further left, but the worst case is that they jump one position back each time. But you can't go more to the right than you went to the left. There's no teleporting. So the total number of jumps, the total number of failure links you follow is at most the number of positions in the text. If you want more formally, you can say that in each iteration of this outer while loop, we either make I bigger or I minus Q bigger. And so in each case, we make progress, and we cannot not do progress for one of the two. But then individually, I can be made at most n times bigger than I'm at the end of the text. And I minus Q can also not be made more than n times bigger. So each of the cases can, summed over all the iterations, only happen at most n times. So after 2n steps, 2n iterations, the loop's done. So even though at first sight maybe looks like it's slower, it isn't really. Only a factor 2. What's left out here is the computation of the failure links. That was just a call to this function with a forward reference. The algorithm here is very, very similar to the computation of this deterministic automaton. Basically, you simulate, again, leaving off the first character, you simulate where you would have gone, to what state you would have gone with the prefix with one shorter. And now, instead of copying the outgoing transitions of this state x, you insert a failure link to that state x. And that's all. Maybe we can do a short example instead of diving through the code. That was the famous example from all the chapter. So let's try from 0 to 1. We take edge A. Now, state 0 doesn't need a failure link because you're already on the floor, right? You have nothing that you've read. So let's go to next state. Now I need a failure link for 1. So the failure link for 1, I'm starting with nothing. So I have A that I've read. If I chop off the first character, that's nothing. So that's staying in state 0. So my X, I'm marking that again here, is state 0. And the failure link for 1 goes back to 0. And that's not an X, that's a cross. I can't really draw this better, I think. Let's add another state. So state 3. And here's an A. Now I'm adding the failure link for state 2. What do I have to do? Well, I could either say I'm simulating the automaton from the beginning with one character less, so with the B. Or I could start where I left off and go one step further. Now in this case it's the same because we're just at the beginning. So I'm walking one step from 0 with a B, but that actually leaves me where I am. Right? So here's another state. Now, did I update my state X correctly? No, I didn't. So this we would have to do now. For 3, the prefix we've read is ABA. So we have to simulate the automaton for BA. B would stay here, failure link, so this is always sigma without A, I'm staying. And then I'm reading A, so I would move with my failure state to 1. And so from 3, with the failure link, I'm going to 1. Okay. Let's do one last one so that we see the construction with the failure link. The failure link for 3 with BA was this red thing. If I now move to 4, I would have wanted the simulation for BAB. I already know where BA brought me, so I'm leaving from the red one with a B. That brings me to state 2. And hence the failure link for 4 would have to go here. Okay? That way you can construct these, and that should match what the algorithm here does. It keeps track of the state X, always remembers this in this fail array. The failure links now are a single array. And then you always make one step. Okay. Very similar to the previous code, this looks like it might be slow because there's an outer loop that runs for m iterations. And there's an inner loop that might also run for m iterations because you move, again, you follow failure links to the left. By the very same argument, again, this inner loop in total cannot run more than m times. Because before you can make x smaller, you have to have made x larger previously, and you only make it larger down here, and only by one thing at a time. So over the course of all iterations of the outer loop, you're making x at most m bigger. And this always makes x strictly smaller. So you cannot make x in total more strictly smaller than m times when you never make it bigger than m times. Okay. That's why also the computation of the failure links is linear in the word you're doing this over, the pattern in this case. So in total, we have, for the Knuth-Moore spread, a linear cost in both text and pattern length, and no dependence on the alphabet whatsoever. Again, for bioinformatics context, it's not super critical, but it's useful. Cutting a factor 2 is always good. In the worst case, this is best possible because you have to read the text and the pattern to make sure that you've caught all the occurrences. Now, you could go further in this, depending on the type of data. Sometimes you can do a little better if you're assuming that it's not the worst case. So for certain types of texts and patterns, you can hope to do better. In the worst case, KMP is already best possible. For historic reasons, there's a different notation that's widely used called the prefix function with slightly shifted indices. I think by and large for this module, I'm not sure if this occurs. It might occur in some of the textbooks that I cited on the website. So maybe just keep in mind that these failure links that we computed in KMP are intimately related to some other function called the prefix function or the pi function, which occur in some other texts that describe this in slightly different words, but it's the same thing up to maybe a shift by -1. So whenever you read about these in other sources, you might have to live with an off by 1. This is there's just no global consistency on even whether strings should start with 0 or 1 as the index, but also here whether you include the length or the stopping index. Okay, just be warned about that. That leaves a little bit of time for looking at the generalization of the Knuth-Moore-Spratt algorithm. That's the Aho-Korosik algorithm. And that brings us a bit closer again to our original problem, namely the read mapping problem. Remember, all that I've told you so far is working with a single pattern. And if I apply this to the read mapping problem, I can only do it pattern by pattern. So I take one pattern, I pre-process it into this KMP automaton, then I run the text through with this automaton and I find the occurrences. But if I have to do this for every pattern, for every read individually, I'm going to read the entire genome 200 million times. That's not going to fly. That's just too slow because P is actually the largest parameter here. Okay, N is a bit bigger, but P is much bigger than we would want it to be here. It's going to be too slow to do P times N. Now, much of what KMP does, in particular this clever use of failure links to keep reading one character at a time, can be generalized if we're looking for several patterns in one go. So what we'll do next is build an automaton that contains several patterns and does the same kind of job as KMP. Read one character of the text at a time and tell me what matches are seen so far. That's what Aho and Korosik developed. Formally, we're looking at the multiple pattern matching problem. So we're given the text and several patterns. Same notation as in the read mapping problem at the beginning. I just wanted to repeat the notation that people are remembering. The patterns can have different lengths. What we'll need as well is the total length, because that will pop up in the running time. Now, given that input, the goal is to find all matches of any of the patterns in the text. Now, what this means is that we want to return these pairs, position in the text, and then the index of which pattern matches there. So it's a concise representation, and we want to return all of those pairs. That's for the biological context. You don't want to find just the first occurrence. You want really all of them. Now, the final result of this section will be that this Aho-Korsic algorithm can do M pre-processing, so the total length of the patterns, and then read through the text exactly once. It'll have this extra cost of the size of the output, because if you look at this, in the worst case, you can have at every position, all patterns could match. If the patterns are all A's of different numbers of A's and the text is all A's, right? And at every position you find all the patterns. You're very happy, but the output is bigger than the text. It's a bit of a degenerate case, but to make this generally true, you have to say the running time depends also on the size of the output, the number of these pairs. In all sensible applications, this will be much smaller than n, and then the dominating contribution is from the length of the text. Now, for the read mapping problem, the dominant contribution will probably be the pre-processing if you wanted to throw all of the patterns in at one time. But of course, you can do a reasonable number of them in a batch and then go to the next. The bird's eye overview of the Aho-Korsic algorithm is as follows. We built what corresponds in Knuth Morris Pratt. Maybe let me contrast what we did there. You could say we built first this chain automaton here with just the match edges. That was step one. And then step two was taking this and adding the failure links. Okay. Now, maybe this one also. That will also do in Aho-Korsic. What changes is that this first part is not a single chain, but a trie. And the failure links are very similar, but we do need a third component called output links for a reason that I'll show you in an example briefly that didn't occur in KMP. So this third step, that's kind of the new bit that KMP didn't have to care about. What do we get instead of the linear chain is what is also known otherwise as a data structure just for storing strings in general. It's called a trie. Pronounced is written as in retrieval, but pronounced like in trie. Don't ask me why. It's a way to store a set of strings so that you can efficiently find whether a string is in the set, and you can do some other operations as well. That's maybe for us not so important. Here's a nicely drawn example where the strings have an additional property, namely they all end with an end of string marker. In that case, they all end up in the leaves. The way a trie works is that you read from the root following down some path. Along the edges, there's characters. And if you read the word from the root down to where a string ends, that spells the string. So example here, A, B, A, A, B, you read A, B, A, A, B, plus the $. Okay? If you build a trie for a single string, it's just one line down. That corresponds to what we did in KMP. Okay? Now, the example I shown here with the $, is a little bit of a special case. In general, if some strings are a prefix, can be a prefix of another string, you might also have characters or strings corresponding to internal vertices. Because we need an example anyways, let me draw one, and we'll take the same strings as here, but without the $, at the end. So we'll get some root, then there's a subtree for everything that starts with an A. There's a substring for everything that starts with a B. Then there's more A's, more B's. I'm not drawing this the way you would construct it when you build it. I'm drawing it so that the picture becomes a bit nicer for what follows. So it might only make more sense when you see the final picture. But here is the first string. If you read B, 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 then you find one of the strings that we have. Let me not write it like this, but rather draw it as an accepting state for reasons that will very soon be very clear. Maybe you can already guess. BBA is a string. So this is also accepting. That's BBA. Then we have another B at the end. That's all of those. There's 3 strings that start with a B. That checks out 3 of these accepting states. That branch continues with an A and with a B. The state. And this is accepting because there's A, B, B. That's one of the strings. But it also continues with another A and a B to A, B, B, A, B. And A, B, A, I can continue with A, B. Then I get A, B, A, B. That's that guy. And then we're almost done. AA is accepting. That's the first string. And then another AB, and then we're there. That's AAA, triple AB. Okay, for the sake of the example, what you should take from this picture is this looks a lot like an automaton already. I can start at the root here. These edges are all directed downwards. Some of the states are accepting, namely those that correspond to strings in the set of patterns. And I could say this is something like a non-deterministic finite automaton if I add this loop here. So I have to decide, non-deterministic, I have to guess when to start my descent into the tree. And if I guess right, then I can accept some string. How to determinize this? Again, you could say, let's throw the power set construction in full generality on this. We're not going to do that. The next step is adding failure links in the very same way as KMP. And again, you could formulate this differently. Let me put it here so it better fits there. So it turns out the very same approach as in KMP also works. If you pretend that you do one string after the other as in KMP, you can add the failure links in the same way. Only that I'm, of course, following all the other edges if I have to as well. Let me do an example. Let's take this one, AB, AAB. I'm doing failure links for this one, AB, AAB. How did we do this? We got rid of the first character and see where we end up when we read through the string. So I'm going to have a blue pointer marking the node I'm adding failure links from, and I'm tracking the X, the failure state in red, where the failure link should go to. So I'm starting at the root. Now I read an A. That's the part I only do with the blue. Now red is still at the root because it starts with one letter later. Now, where do I put the failure link from the blue pointer here? Well, to the red. And indeed, from the first level, they will always have to go back to the root. There's nothing else you can do. Now I'm looking at the one longer prefix of my pattern, namely AB. So blue has to move down to AB. And X has to move down following B. So I'm going to go over here. And that's where my failure link should go. So I do that. And then I do another step. And I think you already see where this is going, right? Next character in this pattern is an A, so I follow down here. Next character here, oops, I can't. That's annoying. So I would have to figure out what to do here. It has to go back to the root in this case, right? Is a vertex here. I can't read an A, so I have to take a failure link to the root and then follow the A there. And so I'm adding the failure link here. Now what you see is that you want to process not one string at a time, but rather prefixes of the same length. And so the real way to write this in code is to do a breadth first search in this try. But the concept is very same as we did in KMP. And if you're willing to do the simulation step by step, you can do it without that. Let me do one example just to illustrate the concept. Suppose now let's look at a different string. Let's look at this A, B, B, A, B. And let's look at, say, the prefix that leads here, this ABB. So we want the failure links from here. Okay, that's the blue guy. Where does the failure link have to go to? Well, I have to read BB. And BB leads me down here. So failure link has to go to this place. So the only tricky bit is that in the construction of the failure links, you might rely on having the failure links on any nodes that are above, on layers above. Otherwise, the construction is the same as for KMP. If you do this, every vertex here in the tree gets exactly one failure link. That's the same as in the KMP automaton. And let's maybe not do all of them now. There's a second thing that can happen in this case that didn't occur in the KMP algorithm. And for that, let me illustrate shortly a different example that corresponds. So let's do a shorter one. The strings, the patterns IN and TIN. Maybe that's, in the interest of time, I'm making the example a little shorter. That's one string, and then there's TIN. Now the only non-trivial failure link is this one for I, and that's going to go here. That's going to go here. Now here's, suppose you read in the text and you find TIN, then I would return the match for tin, because that's what this node stands for. But I would forget that there's also a match for in. And this could be worse in that maybe this tin is not in, but is Tina. Then this would go on one more. And I would at this point say, yeah, everything's fine. That's an ordinary node. I'm not going to do anything. And I'll just continue reading, but not report any match. Whereas in reality, in was a match, and I've missed it. That's a problem. So we can't let that happen. But you can add another type of links. That's the output links, which effectively says if a suffix of the string that leads to this vertex is another pattern. In this case, tin is what leads to this node, and a suffix in is an accepting string. I want to output this at this point. So I have a link here from this node to the longest of these patterns, if there's several. And so at any point, I might have to follow this chain of matches and output them right now before moving on. Okay, for now, maybe you just have to take my word that you can compute these in roughly the same way. It turns out, again, you basically find these from this node, you have the string tin. You leave off the first character and see where that leads you. In this case, it leads you right to this accepting state, and it's easy. If there was more than this first character that would be different, then maybe you have to take some failure links. But if you follow this process, same kind of idea, leave off the first character, simulate where that leads you to, you automatically find the longest string that may have a match. And here again, you have to process the strings in a clever order. Other than that, you can do it in one traversal. Okay, let's leave it with that. That's from bird's eye view, the Aho-Korosik algorithm. Essentially, KMP for several patterns. You have to pay attention with this new additional type of pointers, because you cannot in general avoid having some patterns be substrings of other patterns. But it works, and overall time, as I said here, is linear in the patterns. You can build the trie in that time, and you can do the addition of all these pointers in the same time with an additional traversal. Okay.